If God had intended Canada to have music, the Canadian composer Murray Schafer once remarked, Mozart would have been born in Saskatchewan. That slightly sour but witty comment is born of a predicament with regard to the place and perception and sounding form of music in Canada, which is not at all unrelated to a similar predicament, even if it's differently formulated here. The longing for form, the desire for a masterwork, and sometimes even the search for a great Irish composer are dawning or nascent truths which begin to emerge in mid-19th century Ireland and for many people are with us yet. But I would suggest that these longings and this kind of search for a masterwork or desire for a masterwork is in fact a distraction to the historical truth of music in Ireland between 1850 and 1930. Now, this is a long stretch of time by any standards, from the aftermath of famine to a few years before the founding of the state, from the early years of Victorian rule in Ireland to the early years of Fianna Fáil, from 1 year after the death of Maria Edgeworth in 1849 to 8 years after the publication of Ulysses in 1922, or more pithily perhaps, from Imperial to Independent, as the elegant title assigned by Stuart Kinsella to my participation in this series has it. Politically and culturally, there can be few periods in modern Irish history where the shifts in emphasis are so decisive, except perhaps in music. This is the challenge that faces me this afternoon. My brief is choral music, that uncertain but persistent bastion of Anglo-Irish sensibility, not to say identity, that sometimes frail but often sturdy communion of interests between the established Church of Ireland, the establishment itself, and a long and often discreditable history of sectarian contempt and privilege which knew no serious rival in Ireland until the ascendancy of Catholic dominion, which, whatever its disastrous consequences for the new state, did not at least replicate decades and centuries of unwarranted economic self-interest and privilege perpetuated by a landowning class more reminiscent of South Africa or the Congo than anything which might resemble our concept of Ireland as a nation-state from the 1930s. Great hatred, little room, Yeats once remarked of this state of affairs, but there is little evidence to support his nostalgic and fanciful alliance between the Irish peasantry, his term, and that golden age of Anglo-Irish Enlightenment, which Yeats ascribed to Swift, a bizarre choice in my view, Burke, Grattan, Robert Emmet, and even Parnell. It's perfectly true to add that the great architects of Irish cultural and political autonomy were largely Protestant, well-born and English-speaking, at least until the advent of Pádraig Pearse. But it is no less true that a comparatively recent history of TCD, published in 1982, continues to describe 1916 as, quote, a short-lived and localized but alarming civil war, unquote, which is one version of events but not mine. This is another way of saying that for Imperial to Independent, we might read from colonial to native and even from Protestant to Catholic. And this kind of transition, even in the comparatively rarefied domain of choral music, seems to me a case worth testing. Choral music. I might be forgiven for wondering aloud as to my brief in relation to this term. Does it countenance the history of Protestant church music, most notably perhaps as this was cultivated within the narrow but prepotent boundaries of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Christ Church Cathedral, the University of Dublin, and the Chapel Royal in Dublin Castle? Does it comprehend, as I think it probably must, the sectarian complexion of Irish public and cultural life for most of the period in question? One thinks, even beyond this period, of the funeral of Douglas Hyde in St. Patrick's Cathedral as late as 1949, De Valera and most of his ministers skulking outside, unwilling or unable by virtue of their religious denomination to enter and mourn the passing of Ireland's first president, who was also an ardent apostle of Irish cultural and political autonomy into the bargain. Does choral music really extend from the glee clubs and anacreontic jollifications of Victorian Ireland, some of which charmingly survive to the present day, to the Catholic hymnody, much of it saccharine and sentimental, of a nation-state on the verge of convening the greatest affirmation of its religious allegiance, not to say servitude, the Eucharistic Congress of 1932. Jeremy Dibble remarked at the outset of his essay on music in Ireland between 1850 and 1940, published in A History of the Royal Irish Academy of Music, that, quote, "It would not be an exaggeration to say that the socio-political conditions of 19th century Ireland were barely conducive to the nurturing of musical composition," unquote, and adds, and this is very important, that it is true that in many ways the lack of status of music as a cultural force largely reflected the general malaise in Britain, unquote, a remark all the more persuasive on account of Dibble's profound understanding of British music in the 1800s. Likewise, at the other end of the time span, Axel Klein has recently written that, quote, "Music, the universal language, was more often than not perceived as a force of separation rather than unification. It seems that for many Irish politicians in the 1930s and large parts of the population, classical music was simply not an Irish art," unquote. These may seem mild and uncontroversial assertions in 2017, but let me assure you that 30 years ago or so, when I began to rehearse them, it was a different matter. How might one reconcile these gloomy but convincing assessments to the felt life of choral music as was cultivated in a country so completely divided by class, religious affiliation, cultural consensus, and political aspiration? By reciting the succession of choral foundations, occasional composers, and conductors who flourished or not across these religious and cultural divides? By summoning yet again the dramatis personae of Irish church and choral music throughout this period, almost again inevitably along denominational lines? Denis Donoghue once remarked, and this again was in 1982, that in order to contend for the provostship of Trinity College Dublin, one must take the triple precaution of being born in Ireland, educated in Trinity, and being Protestant. No papist need apply, he said. Recent history has proved him wrong on the third score, but his advice held true for a very, very long time. Donoghue was being worldly wise at Trinity's expense, but an implicit allegiance to the crown, or failing that, a British passport, was often the easiest way forward, at least insofar as music was concerned, even if things have changed remarkably since then. Sectarianism, in a more than one direction, as I shall indicate in a moment, has a long reach in Ireland's musical affairs. To put the matter plainly, music in Ireland is not noted for having crossed sectarian boundaries. Given this unassailable perception, we might profitably reconsider the history of choral music in Ireland, especially in view of its proximity to church music in general, as a formative expression of religious and thereby political culture. This too is a case I would like to try here. 80 years, 1850 to 1930, is a fair stretch of time, but as you will have gathered by now, I am unwilling to trudge through the long litany of personnel and institutions associated with Irish choral music, although I will mention many of them during this period, at least not as a chronological obligation. Instead, I will begin in earnest somewhere in the middle, in 1904 to be precise, and use that as a point of departure from which to survey a critical development in choral music as it occurred in Ireland throughout this period, a development which allows us, as I shall argue here, to make sense of this music not as a dutiful chronology, important as this is, but as the expression of a cultural phenomenon. And so I will begin with James Joyce's Ulysses, which, as many people know, is a rather long day in the life of two people in particular, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom, set on the 16th of June, 1904. Late in the novel, Bloom, Jewish by race and birth, and, as people sometimes forget, subsequently Protestant and then Catholic by conversion, is talking to Stephen about church music. And here's the passage itself. So they turned on to chatting about music, a form of art for which Bloom, as a pure amateur, possessed the greatest love, as they made tracks arm in arm across Beresford Place. Wagnerian music, though confessedly grand in its way, was a bit too heavy for Bloom and hard to follow at the first go-off. But the music of Mercadante's Huguenot, Meyerbeer's Seven Last Words on the Cross, and Mozart's 12th Mass, he simply revelled in. The Gloria in that being, to his mind, the acme of first-class music as such, literally knocking everything else into a cocked hat. He infinitely preferred the sacred music of the Catholic Church to anything the opposite shop could offer in that line, such as those moody and Sankey hymns, or Bid me to live and I will live thy Protestant to be. He also yielded to none in his admiration of Rossini's Stabat Mater, a work simply abounding in immortal numbers, in which his wife, Madame Marion Tweedy, made a hit, a veritable sensation, he might safely say, greatly adding to her other laurels and putting the others totally in the shade in the Jesuit Fathers' Church in Upper Gardner Street, the sacred edifice being thronged to the doors to hear her with virtuosos, or virtuosi rather, unquote. Bloom, like his creator, is ignorant of Anglican church music, except perhaps for those proselytizing hymns, but his opinions capture a moment in Irish choral music which, were it not for Joyce's abiding attachment to and fondness for the music of Catholic culture, might easily be lost to the neglected annals of history. Joyce, in life as in fiction, was enamoured of church music inflected by opera, even if he confuses Mercadante and Meyerbeer in this passage, and his eclectic tastes in choral music extended from Palestrina's Pope Marcellus Mass. He regarded Palestrina, quote, as a great hero because he saved the music of the church, to the dramatic indulgence of composers who wrote for the church gallery as fluently as they did for the stage of the opera house. Joyce was alive to the celibate purity, as he regarded it, of Palestrina, as he was to the sensuous strains of a church music inflected by the extravagances of the operatic soloist, and characteristically, he reconciles in his own taste an otherwise fearsome standoff between the old style of Renaissance polyphony and the flirting violin figures of theatrical settings of the Mass and other liturgical texts which animated the debate about Catholic church music in Ireland from the late 1870s to the 1920s. Joyce himself was a staunch Catholic even when he abandoned his faith. In a portrait of the artist as a young man, Stephen Dedalus tells his friend Cranley, when the latter asks him if he might convert to Protestantism, "I told you I have lost my faith, not my self-respect." But in fact, Joyce's remembrances embrace a kind of midpoint between the mildly operatic repertoire, such as it was, of Roman Catholic church music, originating as far back as the 1840s and 1850s, as in Haydn Corrie's arrangements of Cherubini's settings of the Mass for the Pro-Cathedral in the late 1840s, and the radical ultramontanism of Catholic church music and Cecilian reform, which galvanized the Roman Catholic community in Ireland from 1878 until shortly after the Great War. That midpoint was also marked by the papal encyclical Motu Proprio, the correct way, the result of which, as Paul Collins has noted in a forthcoming essay, was that, quote, "the chant was in and the ladies were out." Motu proprio would not have been enough to thwart the great triumvirate of William Walsh, Archbishop of Dublin, and passionate advocate of European musical culture, Nicholas Donnelly, Sicilian extraordinaire, whose refined sense of aesthetic imperative also went hand in glove with his membership of the hierarchy, and Heinrich Beverunge, Maynooth professor and ardent, if intemperate, perpetrator of the scholarly positivism of German musical research. But other events intervened, and the mere force of personality could no longer sustain an aesthetic ideal which itself was increasingly untenable in the face of early 20th century Irish history. The First World War destroyed Beverunge's health. The claims of nationalist politics distracted Walsh from his prior commitment to music, and the attractions of local history finally attenuated even Donnelly's loyalty to a cause to which he had given over half his long lifetime. The devotional reform, at least in its Sicilian aspirations to the regeneration of Catholic church music in Ireland as an expression of European art, was all but over. Soon afterwards, in 1907 to be precise, Joyce again would give expression to the dismay and confusion which followed church music in church music circles following the drastic reforms of motu proprio, the papal edict. Here is Aunt Kate speaking to this very subject in Joyce's great story, The Dead. Quote, Aunt Kate turned fiercely on her niece and said, I know it is all about the honour of God, Mary Jane, but I think it is not at all honourable for the Pope to run out the women of the choirs that have slaved away all their lives and put little whippersnappers of boys over their heads. I suppose it is for the good of the Church if the Pope does it, but it's not just, Mary Jane, and it's not right, unquote. This outburst is all the more pertinent because Mary Jane, quote, had the organ in Haddington Road. It never occurred to Rome to legislate against women playing for or conducting choirs, an omission which reminds me somehow of Queen Victoria's refusal to legislate against lesbianism on the grounds that it was impossible for her to imagine so unnatural a condition. But in any case, we discover here as elsewhere an unlikely witness to the currency of that substitute culture which Emmett Larkin identified as a fundamental seam of Irish life in the 1870s and early 80s. The Dead is set, like Ulysses, in 1904. In the following year, W.H. Grattan Flood published his History of Irish Music, dedicated to Edward Martyn. A typical passage from the close of the second chapter of A History of Irish Music, which surveys Irish music from the 6th to the 9th centuries, confirms Flood's approach to the whole narrative and indeed to the music of his own time. Quote, the reader has seen that the ancient Irish were acquainted with the old music tablature in pre-Christian ages. They had their battle marches, dance tunes, folk tunes, chants and hymns in the 5th century. They were the earliest to adopt the neumes or pneumatic notation for the plain chant of the Western Church. They modified and introduced Irish melodies into the Gregorian chant. They had an intimate acquaintance with the diatonic scale before it was perfected by Guido of Arezzo. They were the first to employ harmony and counterpoint. They had quite an army of bards and poets. They invented the musical arrangement which developed into the sonata form. They had a world-famed school of harpers. And finally, they generously diffused musical knowledge all over Europe. Gee, I think that would get a D- on my... With such an amazing pedigree in the invention and practice of musical discourse, one is tempted to wonder what possibly can have gone wrong. Grattan Flood's own answer to that question is the deracinated condition of Irish life under Norman and English dominion, to say nothing of the virtual disappearance of Gaelic musical culture under the duress of an Anglican polity indifferent or hostile to the great troves of Irish musical intelligence, doomed to lie under centuries of misapprehension or downright neglect. But the paragraph I've just read is no less extravagant in its fantastications than the catalogues of religious orders and saints sonorously rolled out by James Joyce in Ulysses. Joyce was writing fiction inspired by history, but Grattan Flood was writing history, alas, inspired by fiction. In either case, the result was an imagined community of Irishness in which the enchanted authority of musical discourse, for all its visionary grace, depended upon continuity between Catholicism, nationhood, and invented tradition, which could not be sustained. That is why I have dwelt and spent so much time on this midpoint, this 1904 fulcrum, as it were, because it allows us to perceive the meaning, at least in cultural terms, of the entire trajectory of choral music between 1850 and 1930, its overlapping phases of ascendancy culture, chiefly embodied perhaps in the activities of the Dublin University Choral Society, established back in 1837, and the very gradual but unmistakable consolidation of Catholic musical culture from the 1880s onwards. Here I do have to backtrack a little and take in the great other, the great originator of the idea of choral music, at least in Victorian Ireland, which was almost exclusively, but not quite exclusively, associated with the established church, that is to say, with the Anglican Church in Ireland, or Church of Ireland as it later was. One of the most striking features of choral music during the period assigned to me is the longevity of the personnel who dominated its practice and much more modestly its composition. So, for example, I spoke at the beginning of this sort of magic triangle of Trinity and the cathedrals, taking in the Chapel Royal in Dublin Castle along the way. If you consider that Francis Robinson was in one capacity or another dominant in church music in Christchurch from 1807 until 1872, when he died, and was also organist in St. Patrick's Cathedral from 1828 to 1844, or that Robert Prescott Stewart was in in Christchurch from 1844 to 1894, at the same time holding the chair of music in Trinity, or that only a handful of other organists, C.H. Kitson, Thomas Weaving, take up more than our period allots us, you realize that the cultivation of music, at least from a compositional and genuinely from a repertorial point of view, in both Christchurch and St. Patrick's, was very small, and the amount of doubling and the amount of overlap between the two is frankly mind-addling. It's impossible to remember who was where because most people were in both places. It's also the case north and south of the country, much later in the period. In fact, starting by pure coincidence, again in 1904, we realised that somebody like Captain C.J. Brennan was organist and master of the choristers at St. Anne's in Belfast from 1904 till 1964. And if that isn't northern tenacity, what is? There's a wonderful, I just say parenthetically, wonderful photograph of Brennan in the late Harry Grindle's book on Irish cathedral music. The book is worth purchasing for many reasons, but for that photograph alone, man is staring at you and staring at posterity as if to say, would you like me to play for another 60 years? Personnel very, very confined, and even more so, I would say, in our period in the Roman tradition. Again, if you look at something like the complexion of church musicians in the Pro-Cathedral in Dublin, from the appointment of Haydn Corrie in the 1820s, right up to the appointment of Vincent O'Brien as conductor of the Palestrina Choir in 1903. It's not quite a century, but there are really only 3 or 4 people occupying that post throughout, and one sort of succeeding the other, sometimes literally. Vincent O'Brien's a very special case because he's already very well established as a church musician. By the time he comes to the Pro-Cathedral, he becomes an immensely influential figure in Irish musical life, who ranks with other non-church music figures in importance, such as Esposito and, of course, great John Larshay. But the truth is that O'Brien is a man whose work in the Pro-Cathedral takes its cue, as so much Roman Catholic Church music does, in that period, from Sicilian ideals and the reanimating zeal, really, of so-called Palestrinian counterpoint, but at the same time practically emanates from Trinity and the cathedrals. I mean, Vincent O'Brien, as people tend to forget, was educated in the Royal Irish Academy of Music and was a student of Prescott Stewart's, and in that respect he draws close to many of the Anglican musicians whom Stewart taught, including, most famously, a figure we'll turn to in a few minutes, Stanford. So there is some degree of overlap there. Again, if you look at venues following the idea of personnel in the period 1850 to 1930, they're astonishingly reduced. I mean, given the frankly mind-addling seam of musical societies that sprang up in Dublin in really before and after the Act of Union. Again, I don't know how anybody manages to keep track of so many antagonizingly similar societies. You know, one will be the Dublin Musical Society, the other will be the Dublin Society for Music, and you have to remember which is which. But the Dublin University Choral Society, the choral, is without doubt the most important progenitor and indeed curator of choral music in Dublin, and perhaps I think it's reasonable to say in the entire island throughout the 19th century, or certainly from its foundation in the late 1830s. It was rather limited, though. As anybody who's familiar with Trinity will know, the choral thrives to this day and now functions as a college choral society. But originally, as Trinity itself was, of course, in those days, it was only for men and boys associated with the college, and only rather gradually, and one feels somehow reluctantly, admitted women to the society itself. Nevertheless, the Dublin Choral Society wasn't important only for maintaining a culture of oratorical performances, often works by composers such as Mendelssohn and Spohr, but also in animating the idea of some purchase on early music. The very first performance of anything from Bach's B minor Mass, the Crucifixus to be precise, was given by the choral in 1865. And the first performance of the entire work in 1907. The Royal Choral Institute, which followed hot on the heels, really, given our generous time span, in 1851, was founded by a man called John William Glover, who I mentioned very briefly, Glover being one of those organist choirmasters in the cathedral, in the Roman Catholic cathedral. But again, it operated on largely denominational lines. The fact that the Dublin University Choral Society was, an expression of Trinity speaks for itself, but the Royal Choral Institute was almost exclusively Roman Catholic and explicitly a large body of choristers composed chiefly of the working classes. So there is a religious divide in choral music, but there's also, I would think, a social one, at least for much of the much of the 19th century. Probably the most important venue for choral music outside of the churches and cathedrals would have been effectively Dublin's concert hall for most of the latter 19th century, and that, of course, is the ancient concert rooms, which are still there in one shape or another on now Pearse Street. The ancient concert rooms become the most favoured venue for whatever there was of non-sacred, let's put it that way, or non-liturgical choral music in the second half of the 19th century. And Leinster House itself, from 1886, when Esposito makes of that house the centrepiece really for chamber music in Dublin, but also for a good deal of choral music. I'm sorry to say that I'm being a chauvinistic Dubliner and giving so much emphasis to the city in which this talk is taking place, but one at least needs to acknowledge how similar societies and similar venues developed in Belfast and Cork and many other places for that matter. And yet it still seems to me extraordinary that, sometimes the mere facts of music history are instructive in how extreme they are. Who could have believed that the first performance of Messiah in Belfast was in 1854? That deserves an entry in Ripley's Believe It or Not, I think, given how frequently the piece had been done from its inception. Repertory is the most taxing and the most, one might even say, dismaying aspect of choral music in Ireland, particularly in the period that I'm talking about from 1850 until after the foundation of the state. First of all, it was extremely conservative, and in that respect, it was completely indentured to English practice. One of my more donnish comments when I'm teaching is that if you want to understand music in Ireland, you have to understand music in Britain. And the sense in which almost everything in Irish public musical life takes its cue from British musical life is astonishingly exact and intense in the 19th century. And if somebody could suggest to me or persuade me that British music was not in the doldrums for most of the 19th century, then I would be happy to think again. But as things stand, that's my impression and the impression of many other musicologists, notably British ones, which causes me to refine the idea that the fairly deplorable dearth of fresh composition in genres such as the oratorio, to say nothing of instrumental music, which largely non-existent for a long time, is not simply a matter of the internal strife of Irish politics, but rather a matter of the very late arrival of musical romanticism in Britain in the 19th century. I mean, it's hard to believe that a composer such as Elgar could have arrived on the scene, as it were, as late as he did, given how early and nascent the condition of literary romanticism is in England right back at the beginning of the 19th century. Almost all Irish premieres of continental and English works, naturally enough, took place in Dublin, although, as I've intimated already with regard to the Bach, the Mass in B minor, excerpts and selections were much more common than complete performances. And other than Handel and 2 or 3 oratorios by, I think he said by St. Paul, by Mendelssohn, and Spohr and so on, the repertoire was very, very narrow, apart from a few examples that I want to look at now in a moment. Again, just referring to English choral music at the same period, as we get nearer and nearer to the one figure who really could have been a decisive one in relation to music in Ireland, if you think of not only English choral music, but English music generally before the advent of Parry and Stanford, it is in an extraordinarily reduced condition. And even with Parry and Stanford, it receives such a bad press, most of all, I have to say, from Bernard Shaw, who's without doubt the most influential music critic on the English musical scene in the closing decades of the 19th century. It receives such a bad press that it is only regarded by most sort of avant-garde artists or even avant-garde musical critics as being a pale imitation of symphonic and choral Germanism. That's why Shaw was so merciless in relation to the kind of music that Stanford and Parry were writing, irrespective of its generic adherence. So, for example, if Parry and Stanford wrote symphonies, they were merely imitating Brahms, whom Shaw once said was quite a good musician, but he was also emotionally a big baby, and that he had the brains of a third-rate village policeman. So if that was Brahms, you can imagine what poor old Stanford was being called. But there are 2 or 3 sort of, as it were, small surges of creative endeavor in the late, sort of mid to late 19th century, which we at least should take note of, although little more has been done since this music passed into the archive. I mean, if we take a figure like Stanford's teacher, Robert Prescott Stewart, who was also, as I said, hugely influential, teaching Vincent O'Brien, teaching John Millington Synge, for that matter, and of course teaching Stanford. He wrote a very small amount of music, but at least 2 or 3 large-scale works which show an awareness, an acquaintance with the mid-19th century German oratorio, including an ode for the opening of the National Exhibition in Cork from 1852, and a cantata called The Eve of St. John in 1860, and very much later, in 1892, a tercentenary ode for Trinity itself. Similarly, one finds, with regard to the Roman Catholic tradition, that Glover wrote 3 oratorios which more or less faded quickly, but at least showed some awareness of the possibility of the oratorio becoming, as it were, a domestic Irish genre, rather than hearing Elijah for the 10th or 15th time. But the most important person, without doubt, is Charles Villiers Stanford. Now, I want to turn directly to a quotation from the Encyclopedia of Music in Ireland and to read a remark that struck me once again when I was reading for this paper. This is Axel Klein and Paul Rodmell talking about Stanford. quote, Stanford was undoubtedly the most prolific Irish composer of works for choir, soloist and orchestra. Between 1875 and 1911, he wrote 33 works of this kind, the majority of which have yet to be performed in Ireland. So, you know, the impulse to look back shouldn't be supervened by the impulse to look around and become aware of the fact that works such as, you know, Songs of the Sea, Songs of the Fleet, The Voyage of Maeldoon, Pádraig Cruthair, I can hardly believe that that work has not been heard at least once in Ireland. But my favourite example, and the one I will come to repose on as I bring this talk to an end, is of course Stanford's Requiem, which I think, admit my best my knowledge of Stanford is partial but pervasive with regard to a couple of central works. But people who know Stanford better than I hail the work as his masterpiece. And although it was recorded right here actually in 1994, it has, other than that, not been done in this country, as far as I'm aware. As you move then towards the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, again, there are occasional addresses on choral music by composers very active in other domains. The obvious examples are people who are writing for choral societies such as James Culwick, although the Culwick Society is long after him. Michele Esposito, who writes a great deal of instrumental music, piano music, writes a charming opera, which was much beloved of Douglas Hyde, but writes really very little choral music. He writes a cantata called Deirdre, which is quite a well-known work in the literature growing around Irish music, but in terms of an awareness of the piece itself, has had almost no echo or afterlife. And there are other composers whom we are even less conscious of, one who set a lot of joys, including Geoffrey Molyneux Palmer, and then composers who have Irish affiliations. But most of the work that they were writing, including as far back as Stanford, were, as it were, in spite of rather than because of a choral environment. And then coming nearer to our own time and to the end of our period, we have perhaps the most extreme example of composers writing very significant, inherently significant music, which was absolutely doomed to silence, and with one remarkable exception very recently here in Dublin, continues in that way. And that, the person I'm thinking of is Ina Boyle, who wrote several large-scale works for choir, which were never performed, and whose, a seminal final symphony, Third Symphony from the Darkness, which takes us right to as far as 1951, remains in the darkness to this moment. So the catalogue is small, the number of works is incidental, and yet it has to be said, against the grain of all of what I've just said, that notwithstanding this ambivalent attitude to newly created choral music, to creating opportunities for choral music, we can return to the practice of music in church, where choral music did at least afford an outlet, or choral music was afforded an outlet. So, for example, Stanford's music, although largely neglected, was emphatically not neglected in the cathedral tradition in regard to at least two of his big services in A and B flat, and certain of his anthems. And in the same way, for a limited period at least, a lot of the music that was written in emulation of the Saint Cecilian style had an extraordinary outing, a short-lived but an extraordinary outing right across the country. Limerick, Cork, Belfast, you name it. And so the kind of enthusiasm with which this music was promulgated and cultivated stands in ironic proportion to the short period of time during which it flourished. So I think it's only fair to acknowledge that within those narrower confines of sacred musical practice, rather more was happening than in the larger sphere and much more politically fraught sphere of concert life. However, I want to sort of come home to roost on the Requiem by Stanford, which is a work that dates from 1897. And There are two interesting things about this work, and a believe it or not type of thing. One is that it's the first setting of the Requiem Mass by a non-Roman Catholic. And the other is that Stanford was not only Protestant and Unionist, but intemperately anti-Catholic, and yet overcame his anti-Catholic feeling to write this piece in memoriam his friend, the British painter Frederick Leighton. Jeremy Dibble says of this work that its choral writing contains the most operatic and most persuasive dramatic music that Stanford ever wrote. Unfortunately, the work was radically eclipsed by The Dream of Gerontius, which followed the Requiem 3 years later, a work which, as you know, had a disastrous first outing, but very quickly, not least thanks to Bernard Shaw's enthusiasm, it became institutionalized as an oratorio classic. Now here you have two works, a setting of the Requiem Mass and a setting of a work by John Henry Newman. And the obvious thing they have in common, apart from their forces and the fact that they're both monumental choral works, is that they are Catholic works, both unmistakably Catholic works. And what I find poignant to an almost unbearable degree is that whereas The Dream of Gerontius, just perhaps a decade and a half after our period ends, in the early 1950s, had become completely, as it were, absorbed into the Irish choral mainstream, because really after the war, the whole countenance and complexion of choral music changes completely in this country. The number of choral societies that are established, Our Ladies itself, which became intimately associated with Gerontius, was established, I think, around 1941 or thereabouts. Everything changed, and that work, Gerontius, satisfied what I began at the outset, what I described at the outset as this desire for a masterwork. It was adopted, as it were, by Irish choral musical culture in a way that Stanford's Requiem never was. I find that remarkable. I find it poignant, partly because Stanford himself was so decisively eclipsed by Elgar, but also partly because we may have simply been looking in the wrong place. I mean, by insisting upon these denominational and even national divisions, it seems foolish to therefore, in some literal-minded way, deny the fact that whether you like it or loathe it, the intensely conservative Roman Catholic culture of Ireland in the 1940s and 50s found its answering echo in the passion and genius of Elgar's music. And the work became part of the very culture of Roman Catholic church music, and in fact, church music generally. Not so much church music, but choral music. Whereas the Requiem, Stanford's masterpiece, from the moment it was done, never really got off the ground. Now that would make me think that, in a way, this desire for a masterwork, satisfied by Gerontius 20 years after our period ends, also may not be the work that people desired. Or to put it in another way, that the obsession, this quest for greatness in Irish music, or this quest to identify somebody who would answer the longing for form, or even the longing for some kind of rapprochement through the agency of choral music and indeed other kinds of music, was answered unexpectedly because of the intense Catholicism of Gerontius itself, irrespective of its the nationality of its composer. However, on the other hand, it seems to me no less deplorable that the thinking that has led to a divide, as it were, between Stanford as basically happened to be Irish, Anglo-Irish, and therefore not part of the new state. That seems to me deplorable because we need to retrieve and recover and reclaim Stanford from that period in a way that hasn't really happened to date, except, as I said, within the dominion of liturgical music, where certain of his works have never gone out of circulation. If we can do it for Oscar Wilde, we can certainly do it for Charlie Stanford. That seems to me as good a place as any to pause. I imagine time is probably pushing on. So thank you very much indeed.